They dropped her from the sky with no warning and no words, only the heavy sound of metal grinding against metal as the cargo door opened above the prison pit, and the small human figure was pushed out into the darkness below. The wind roared past her ears as she fell down toward the ground, her body twisting through the air. Her arms spread wide, but she did not scream. She did not flinch. She did not close her eyes. The pit was a world of stone and steel, a giant hollow carved into the crust of a dead moon filled with the galaxy's worst creatures, beings who had slaughtered entire ships, razed planets, hunted civilians, and torn their enemies apart with claws and teeth and acid and rage. The pit was their cage, a place where the universe pretended justice still lived, where monsters were thrown to fight until only silence remained. When she landed, the sound echoed across the walls. It was not a scream or a cry of pain. It was the soft crack of bone, shifting of muscle bracing the ground beneath her feet held her weight, and she stood slowly, straightening her back, her face calm, her eyes narrow, her lips pressed together like a sealed lock around her. The beasts watched, hidden in the cracks of stone in the corners where shadows moved. Some with skin that shimmered in poison colors, others with limbs bent the wrong way, eyes that blinked sideways. Rows of fangs dripping with hunger. None of them spoke in any tongue the human ear could know, but all of them understood the same thing. Someone new had arrived, someone small, someone soft, someone human. The largest among them, a beast twice her height, covered in scars and bone armor, stepped out from behind a jagged boulder. It snarled deep in its throat, a sound like thunder in a storm, and began to walk toward her, slow and certain, like it had done this 1,000 times before. Its claws scraped against the stone, its teeth bared in blood. Staying still, she did not move. She did not back away. Her eyes never left the beast's face. Not in fear, but in stillness. Her body stood like a statue, a thing made of steel and memory, her hands at her sides. Her shoulders relaxed, her breath, even not fast, not panicked. When the beast lunged, everything exploded into motion, claws slicing through the air, its weight crashing down toward her head. But she stepped aside, so smooth, so easy, like she had seen it before, like she had danced with monsters in her dreams. Her hand shot forward, not with a punch, but with 2 fingers pressing hard against a small soft point at the beast's throat, and in one blink it stumbled into it. Dropped to its knees in 3, it collapsed at her feet, its body twitching, as if shocked by the betrayal of its own strength. Silence fell over the pit, a silence deep and strange, the kind that made even the other beasts hesitate. They watched from the dark, unsure if what they had seen was luck or something else, something worse than teeth and claws, something more dangerous than hunger. She looked around, slowly turning her head, her eyes sweeping across the creatures hiding in the shadows. Her gaze held no hate, no fear, no pride, only understanding, and something colder than space itself. She picked up a piece of broken metal from the ground, shaped it in her hand, twisted it into a sharp edge, and turned her back on them all, walking toward the far wall where no creature dared sleep. Night fell on the pit with no stars above, only the cracked dome of sky and the weak pulse of dying lights. The creatures whispered in the language of clicks and growls, their voices nervous, unsure. She had not screamed, she had not run, she had not begged. This human, this small, silent human, had brought down a hunter in seconds and claimed its place in the pit without speaking a word. In the corner of the pit near the fire, bones burned from past kills, the flames weak, the heat thin and flickering. She sat beside them, not for warmth, but for sight. She sharpened the metal in her hand, carving it against a stone, her fingers working slow and steady, every scrape echoing in the pit like the ticking of a clock. One of the smaller creatures crept near, cautious, curious, a thing with long eyes and thin skin. It sniffed the air as it moved, but it stopped a few steps away from her, sitting still as if waiting for permission. She did not speak, she did not smile, but she did not stop it either, and so it sat there beside her in silence, watching the fire, watching the woman who had killed a giant without blinking. She remembered nothing of joy, not anymore, not since the chains, not since the betrayal, not since the cold Room with voices behind glass, speaking of control and tests and what happens when you push a mind too far. But the pit was simple. The pit was truth. The pit was a place where lies died and only action remained. She did not care about the beasts, not yet, not today. She cared only about learning, about the walls, about the sounds, about the patterns of movement, about the way the guards above watched from behind shields too high to touch, too far to hear. She was not afraid of them. They were afraid of her, afraid enough to throw her here, and hoped the beasts would end what their machines could not. But she was not made to be ended. She was made to endure, and then to break, and then to become something else, something sharper, something stronger, something that could walk through fire and come out colder than before. The pit would test her, and she would test it. Back and by the end of it, the beasts would not remember her as human. They would remember her as the one thing worse than all of them combined. They would remember her as the real monster. The second night came with colder air and longer shadows, the kind that clung to the bones and whispered old truths into the ears of those who listened. The fire near the wall still burned, weak but steady, and the woman sat beside it just like before, silent, watchful, her back straight, her eyes scanning everything, even the things that did not move, even the dark corners where sound held its breath. Creature that had sat beside her the night before was still there, smaller than the others, softer in both form and gaze. It made no threat, no move to claim territory or challenge anything. It simply stayed near her like a quiet shadow, like something that had seen too much and survived by learning when not to be seen. The woman noticed it, of course. She noticed everything, but she neither welcomed nor rejected its presence. And so they existed side by side, two broken pieces of different puzzles, fitting for a reason they did not yet understand. Beasts were restless that night, more restless than before. Some prowled in circles, claws dragging across the stone. Others made low growls that vibrated in their chests and rippled through the pit. Their hunger was growing, not just for food, but for control. Because control was survival, and survival was the only law here. One of them finally made its move. A lean creature with red skin and two mouths stepped forward from the shadows toward the fire, its eyes locked on the woman, its posture low and ready, not like the giant from the first night. This one was a hunter by trade, not brute force, but speed. Precision. Skill. It came fast, faster than thought, a blur of motion, aimed at her throat with twin fangs wide, and a sound that rang like metal snapping in half. But she was faster, not in movement, but in intent. She shifted her weight sideways, letting the creature fly past her, and as it did, she raised the sharp piece of metal she had shaped the night before and slid it along the underside of its neck, not deep enough to kill, but deep enough to stop the fight. Before it could start, the creature crashed into the wall, rolled once, and hissed, blood spilling from its wound. It did not rise again. Woman stood slowly, her breathing steady, her body unshaken by the attack. Her eyes turned toward the rest of the pit where the others now stared. More cautious than before, they had seen her kill once. Now they had seen her spare, which in the pit was often more terrifying than death, because mercy meant control, and control meant power of the kind only the strong could carry. She sat again by the fire, not because she was tired, but because she had made her point, and points in the pit were not spoken. They were carved into flesh and written in silence. The small creature beside her inched closer, as if sensing the end of danger. It watched her hands as she cleaned the metal edge and pressed new grooves into the stone. It understood something, now something the others were only beginning to see. She was not surviving, she was planning. Every move she made had reason, every breath was measured, every look placed with purpose. The pit was not chaos to her, it was a pattern, a broken machine waiting for someone who could see the gears beneath the blood. In the days that followed, she began to walk the edge of the pit, not quickly, not openly, just slow circles, watching where creatures gathered, watching who fought, who waited, who took, and who gave. She saw the way they split into small groups, into lines of loyalty or fear, and she took note of the ones who watched her in return, not with hunger, but with thought. Those would be the ones to watch more closely, not the strongest, not the loudest, but the quiet ones, the thinkers, the ones who knew That power came not from noise, but from silence sharpened like a knife one. Afternoon, while the red light from above dimmed and the false sun that powered the dome flickered, she saw two creatures arguing near the north wall, a tall one with scales that shimmered and a smaller one covered in spikes. They circled each other like dancers not fighting yet, but close she moved toward them, slowly, not with challenge but curiosity, and when she reached them, they paused, both turning to look at her. Unsure whether she had come to join or end the fight, she did neither. She pointed to the wall behind them, a crack in the surface wide and deep. Not natural, not made by weather. Something had hit it from the other side recently, perhaps a tremor, or perhaps something else. The beasts did not understand the meaning, but she did. She touched the crack once, then stepped back and walked away, not saying a word, not explaining, because words were wasted in the pit, and those who wanted to live would either follow or fall. That night she sat by the fire again, the small creature beside her, the red-skinned hunter on the other side, its wound wrapped in fabric torn from one of the fallen. Others sat near, not close, but near enough to see her near. Enough to understand that something was changing. The pit no longer belonged to chaos, it belonged to her, and they were beginning to feel it in their bones. Still, the guards above said nothing. The watchers behind the glass did not speak, only adjusted the cameras and increased the scans, confused by the patterns forming below. They had thrown her into the pit, expecting screams, expecting fear. Instead, they were watching a system rise from dust and blood, a structure without walls, without words. Only the will of a single human girl who refused to die in her sleep, or what little rest she allowed herself. She dreamed not of Earth, not of home, not of anything lost. She dreamed of fire, of dark halls filled with red lights and cold voices, of men and women in uniforms telling her she was not ready, telling her she was dangerous, telling her she would break. And in those dreams, she never spoke, only watched, only waited until the walls cracked and everything fell down, just like the pit, just like now, because she had been made for war, but never sent to it, because they were afraid not of what she might lose, but of what she might become. And now she was becoming, and nothing in the pit, not the claws or the teeth or the watchers above, could stop it. She opened her eyes as another day began, her breath slow, her hands steady, her body quiet, and beside her the small creature stared at her like a prayer waiting to be answered. She did not speak, but something in her eyes said clearly the real war was coming, and she would win it. The third cycle in the pit began with a silence heavier than usual, not the kind born from fear or exhaustion, but the kind that arrived before something shifted deep and wide like a storm, still hidden beyond the cliffs. Her eyes opened long before the light returned to the cracked dome, her hands already moving across the sharpened piece of metal she had shaped with care, carving new edges, adding weight with bone, tying it with strips of scaled skin. It was not just a weapon now, it was a memory of every beast she had faced and every lesson she had learned. Fire no longer flickered. Alone it had grown with scraps of fabric, metal, and dried pieces of strange plant matter thrown in by those who now gathered near her, not friends, not allies, not even followers, but shapes drawn closer by gravity, not the kind found in planets, but the kind found in power. The small creature had not left her side since the second night, and while it said nothing and showed little emotion, it kept watching her with those wide, uncertain eyes, as if waiting for something it could not name, as if knowing the safety it felt was not free, but earned and easily lost. Today was different, not because of any word spoken, but because the air itself felt thicker, as if the pit was holding its breath, and even the creatures who loved to howl and scrape their claws against the stone stayed quiet. A new shape had appeared across the upper ridge, a creature larger than any she had seen before, with skin like black oil and eyes that did not blink. It moved slowly with the weight of something ancient, something cruel. Its body carried marks that did not look like battle scars, but ceremonial cut symbols of something darker than war. The others moved away when it stepped forward, its presence alone forcing distance, not from command, but from instinct. Even the bold ones, the loud ones, the ones who still believed in strength, through sighs lowered their gaze and stepped back when it passed. She did not She stood slowly, her weapon in hand, her breath steady, her face unreadable. The black beast stopped a few feet from her, its head, tilting slightly as if surprised to find one who would not move it, made a sound low and deep, not a growl, not a roar, but something like a voice twisted into something alien. It was not a challenge, not yet, it was a test. She took one step forward, not rushed, not forced her eyes, never leaving its face, and with that single step the rules changed because the pit had never been ruled by words or roars. It had always followed the law of motion, and hers was now the first motion that mattered. The fight began without warning, without signal. The black beast lunged with a force that cracked the stone beneath its feet, its arms' wide claws gleaming in the weak light, and she met it not with strength, but with speed, her body moving low, her weapon striking under the ribs where the skin was softer, and the black liquid sprayed across the ground with a hiss. It howled and swung with rage, but she twisted and turned her feet, moving like she had danced through battles. Long before she ever touched this prison moon, her strikes were not random, they were cold, precise, placed with the knowledge of muscle and bone and nerve endings that snapped when pushed just right. Others watched, not cheering, not waiting, just watching as something ancient fought something new, and something human refused to kneel. The black beast landed a strike across her shoulder, tearing skin and drawing blood, but she did not fall. She used the pain like memory, sharp and deep, driving her forward, and with one final movement she brought the metal deep into its throat and held it there until the beast stopped moving, its body crashing to the ground like a mountain breaking apart. She stood above it, chest rising slowly, blood running down her arm and eyes still locked forward. The silence that followed was not empty, it was filled with recognition, and for the first time the creatures of the pit lowered their heads, not in fear, but in choice. She walked away, not claiming the body, not shouting, not celebrating. She sat again by the fire, the wound on her arm already wrapped by her own hand, using pieces of cloth and instinct, while the small creature pressed closer, not afraid, not confused, just present. Now the watchers above leaned closer to their screens, their voices sharp and uncertain, because the black beast had been sent as a measure of finality. Not as a test, it had been a message, a warning meant to destroy her before her control grew, before the other monsters forgot they were monsters and remembered they could follow, but their message had failed. She had turned it into a reply, and her reply had been carved into the pit. That night she began drawing into the dirt with the sharp edge of a stone. Not art, not symbols, but paths, lines, points of entry, cracks in the wall, locations of the overhead shields, timing of the lights, movement patterns of the guards. Even in the shadows above, her mind was not resting. It was expanding, taking the pit apart, piece by piece, not with brute force, but with understanding. Some of the creatures began to mimic her, not with words or actions, but with stillness. They began to watch more, began to observe her movements, began to understand that survival did not only belong to the strongest, but to the one who could see 10 steps ahead. She did not speak to them, but when they approached, she did not stop them, and slowly they began to share food. Water, stolen rags, metal fragments. Whatever the pit still offered became part of her growing control, not through fear, but through structure and purpose. She trained in the empty space between the fire and the wall, using her own body as weight, her movements fluid and sharp, her arms and legs bruised and bloodied, but stronger every hour, every strike carving not just power but memory into her bones. And when the cycle ended, when the false sky above began to dim again, she looked up, not in hope, but in calculation. Because hope was for those who waited, and she was not waiting, she was preparing, because she knew the watchers would not stop. She knew the pit was just the first ring of a larger cage, and when they realized she was not breaking, they would send worse than the black beast. They would send fire. They would send gas. They would send machines, and when they did, she would not hide, she would rise, because they had thrown her into the pit to silence her. But in the silence she had become something they could never silence again. Walls of the pit had once looked like death to those trapped inside, but now they looked like something else, something uncertain, something waiting, because the one who sat near the fire no longer seemed like a prisoner. She moved through the broken world of stone and ash, like a silent force, not bound by fear or hunger. Her steps were measured, her eyes sharp and her silence heavy with meaning. The others had stopped seeing her as a victim and began seeing her as something more, something they could not name, but deeply understood. Every part of the pit now held her mark, not in words or symbols, but in movement and control, in patterns that no one else had the patience to see. She had turned the chaos into a rhythm, a structure that only she could follow, and only she could shape. Her wounds had healed with rough hands. Steady grit, her body tougher, her mind clearer. The strange creatures who once circled her now stood watch around the fire. Some came closer every cycle, not because she called them, but because her presence was a gravity too strong to resist. One day, a sound came from above, louder than the usual grinding of doors and dropping of bodies. It was a hum, a vibration that filled the pit and made the creatures raise their heads. The fire trembled slightly, and the air thickened as if something heavy was about to fall, not from the sky, but from the system itself. Her eyes followed the sound, and she stood slowly, not in fear, but in readiness. Because this was not just another creature being thrown into the pit. This was something else, something planned. A new door opened from above, and a long black box was lowered down into the center of the pit. Not a living thing, not a broken piece of ship, but a container sealed tight, made of a smooth metal that shimmered in a strange way. It touched the ground and hissed open. From within came smoke, and then a sound, not of rage, but of pain, sharp and loud and wrong. A creature crawled out, not like the others. This one was shaped like a man, but twisted, broken, its skin covered in metal plates, wires running through its arms, its eyes dull and red, its mouth covered with something that looked like a mask. It did not growl, it did not attack. It stumbled forward as if confused, as if controlled, and then its body snapped into action like a puppet. With invisible strings, it rushed toward the nearest creature, slamming into it with impossible speed, tearing into flesh with steel hands. The pit exploded with movement and confusion. The creatures scattered, the fire was kicked into ash, and the air filled with screams, not from the twisted thing, not from the beasts, but from something deeper, something wild. She did not run. She watched the creature with eyes that knew exactly what it was, because she had seen things like it before in the place they kept her, in the place where they trained her, tested her, tore her apart, and rebuilt her, where they tried to shape her into something useful. And when she refused to break, they threw her away like trash into this hole. And now they had sent a piece of that place after her, thinking maybe this machine could do what the pit had failed to do. But they had made a mistake, a big one, because she was not the same as when she arrived. She was no longer alone. She was no longer uncertain. And this was not her cage anymore. It was her home, and nothing entered it without facing her first. She picked up her weapon and stepped forward. The twisted machine noticed her and stopped for a second, its head twitching as if trying to remember something. Then it charged faster than anything she had faced before, but she did not move until the last second. Then she dropped to the side, her blade slicing into one of its legs. Wires snapped, sparks flew, and the machine stumbled but did not fall. It turned, swinging its arm toward her head, and she blocked with both hands, using the handle of her blade like a shield. The impact sent her flying back against the wall, her shoulders screaming in pain. But she stood again, because pain was no longer an enemy, it was fuel. The creatures of the pit watched from all sides, frozen, unsure if they should help or flee. Some of them had learned from her, but not all had found the courage to stand beside her until now. One of the larger ones, a beast with thick arms and 3 eyes, stepped forward and threw a rock at the machine, not to hurt it, but to distract it. And in that moment, she moved again, fast, low, cutting through the side of its knee, sending it crashing to the ground. The small creature that always stayed beside her rushed forward, without thought, grabbed the piece of metal and stabbed it into the machine's eye socket. Sparks burst again, and the machine shrieked, a terrible sound that shook the pit and made even the strongest beasts cover their ears. The woman pulled her weapon back and drove it into the machine's chest, deep enough to reach something important, and with one final push, the light in its eyes died and the body fell still. Silence returned, but it was not the silence Of fear this time, it was something else, something deeper. A silence filled with decision. The creatures looked at her, and for the first time, their eyes showed not just respect or caution, but loyalty. They had seen her fight something that was not of this pit, something colder, something designed to kill without reason, and they had seen her win not alone, but with them. She looked around the pit, not with pride, not with triumph, but with certainty. She began walking toward the wall again, not to rest but to plan, because now she knew for sure they would keep sending things worse than before, and if they waited, they would all die one by one, without purpose. So she would not wait anymore. She gathered those who had stayed close, those who had learned, those who had watched, and she pointed to the walls, to the cracks, to the towers above, where guards walked with lazy steps behind thick glass and false comfort. She pointed not with hope, but with intention, and slowly, one by one, the others nodded. Some growled softly, some raised weapons they had shaped in secret. Some touched their chests as if remembering something lost, but all of them looked up. She was no longer just the one they feared, she was the one they would follow, and now the pit was no longer a place they feared. Now it was the ground where their uprising would begin. The pit no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a wound healing itself from the inside. A place that once swallowed screams now echoed with quiet movement and growing purpose. The woman stood at the center, where the fire used to burn, where blood had once soaked the stones, where monsters had fought without reason and now gathered with eyes full of intent. She no longer carried her blade like a weapon. She carried it like a truth. It had seen too much, felt too much, broken too much, and still it held together, like her, like the creatures who now watched her, waiting for the signal they could feel in the stillness before the storm. Above them, the guards walked their usual path, unaware that the ground beneath them had changed, unaware that the silence was not peace, but preparation, unaware that the monsters they had mocked and dumped like waste had found something far more dangerous than rage. They had found unity and a leader who had nothing left to lose. The crack in the wall that she had studied for days was now wide enough to slip through, not because it had grown, but because she had made it grow piece by piece, strike by strike, every night. While the others slept, she worked on the stone, carving through it with the edge of her mind and the fire of her will, until it finally gave in to her patience. She had chosen 5 to follow her through the wall, the quiet one with no voice but sharp eyes, the strong one who never spoke but stood when she stood, the one with claws who used to fight everything until he learned what it meant to stand still, the fast one who had once tried to steal from her and now guarded her back, and the small creature who had never left her side since the first night and still walked in her shadow like a soul searching for light. They slipped through the crack without sound into the tunnels behind the pit, where old wires and forgotten machines breathed dust and rust. The air was cold and tasted like metal, but it did not slow them. They moved like one body, one shape, cut from silence and shaped by fire. The path led upward, not straight, but winding like a serpent's trail, hidden from the guards, but not from her. She remembered every map she had glimpsed during her training, every whisper of prison design, every emergency tunnel, and every forgotten corridor. Her memory was not perfect, but her instinct filled the gaps, and her anger kept the pace. They reached a hatch, a thick door meant to hold back things like fire or flood or monsters, but not her. She pulled the panel from the wall and tore into the wires with fingers that did not shake, because shaking was for those who doubted, and she had no room left for doubt. The door opened into light, not sunlight, but harsh white light, cold and clean and full of questions. The kind of light that burned the truth out of everything it touched. On the other side were men in armor, not surprised enough, not ready enough. They reached for weapons, but her team moved first, claws, teeth, speed, silence, and in seconds the hallway was red and quiet again. She walked past the bodies without looking, because they were not the goal. They were just the locks on the way to the cage, where the key had always waited. More came, alerted by the alarms that screamed too late. Doors opened, and bullets flew, but the beasts moved through them like water through cracks. The strong one lifted 2 soldiers and broke them like sticks. The fast one cut a line through 5 before they could breathe. The quiet one slid through shadow and ended. Guards with nothing but his hands, she reached the control room, a circle of glass and machines, where the overseers had always watched and whispered and judged. She stepped inside and saw the faces of those who had dropped her into the pit once proud. Now pale and small, they spoke her name not with recognition, but with regret. And then they reached for buttons and codes and emergency orders, but her blade moved faster, and their words ended before they could make sense. The glass cracked behind her as her team joined her, covered in blood and smoke, but standing tall. They looked around at the room, the walls, the screens, the blinking lights, and they waited for her next breath. She looked at the main console where systems blinked and warnings flashed. Her fingers moved across the controls, not with skill, but with memory. She brought up the map of the facility, the power grid, the prison sectors, the transport bays, and then she did what they never thought she would do. She shut it all down. Every door opened, every light went dark, every lock on every cell broke open, like the chains they used to put on her wrists. The pit was no longer closed, it was wide open, and everything inside was free. She looked into the camera, the one still working. The one that sent her face to the commanders orbiting above, to the generals who thought they were gods, to the scientists who built her to break and left her when she did not, and she said one word: run. Then she smashed the console with the handle of her blade until the sparks filled the room and the lights went black outside. The other creatures were pouring through the tunnels, through the cracks, through the doors. They had once feared the prison was collapsing, not from bombs, not from fire, but from something much worse, from the truth that had grown in the heart of their cage. They followed her not because she was strongest, not because she was human, but because she had done what no one else dared. She had looked into the face of the machine and said no, and then torn it apart piece by piece. She walked into the open corridor where the sky above showed the edge of stars and the shape of distant ships, moving away like rats fleeing a storm. She did not chase them. She had no interest in revenge, only in freedom, and in what came next. The small creature walked beside her, its hand brushing against hers, not asking for anything, just being there. And for the first time she let her hand stay where it was, letting the touch remain not as weakness but as proof that something human still lived inside her. The beasts behind her waited not for orders but for direction, and she pointed toward the edge of the world, not with words, but with motion, because their future would not be spoken. It would be built step by step by those who had survived the worst. She did not smile, but something in her eyes softened as the wind touched her face and the cage disappeared behind her. They had locked her in with monsters, but they were wrong. She was never trapped. She was always rising, and now she had become the storm they could never cage again. The end.